The sky hadn't cleared in weeks. Clouds hung low like a blanket over the village, pressing down on the chimneys and forests with a heavy, wet silence. Mud clung to everything, boots, skirts, the hooves of oxen too tired to pull. The harvest had been poor again, and what little was stored in the granary had already begun to rot. Marjorie watched mold creep over a sack of barley and whispered a prayer, even though her voice barely carried anymore. She didn't pray like the priest did. No grand Latin chants, no long speeches. Just a quiet plea to no one in particular, that the children might sleep tonight with something in their bellies. A mile down the road, Thomas wiped his brow with a rag that used to be part of his shirt. He'd patched it too many times to tell. His hands were calloused and cracked, soil packed so deep in his skin it never truly washed away. He leaned on the wooden handle of his plow and stared at the sky. There was no sun. Not that he needed it. After 3 years of failed crops and rising rents, the sky no longer promised anything. Something had changed after the plague. Before, they'd been powerless. But now there were whispers, not loud, not in the open, but in the barns and by the fire. People were talking about the labor shortage, about how the lords needed them more than ever. That perhaps, just perhaps, they could ask for more. A few brave ones had tried. One village up the road had walked away from their fields entirely, marched to the next manor looking for better terms. Some had vanished. Others had come back limping, eyes low, speaking less than they did before. Still, the thought lingered in the back of their minds. Maybe we were worth more. The lords, of course, noticed. They always did. One could think them blind, shut away in their stone keeps with walls thicker than a man's height, but they saw. They saw the change in posture. The longer gazes, the way peasants no longer bowed, quite so low, and they didn't like it. New rules were nailed to the church doors. Edicts written in Latin, read aloud by priests who couldn't look the people in the eyes. No wandering from your home village. No asking for wages. No talk of rising rents. Those who disobeyed would be disciplined by the grace of the crown. What that meant wasn't written, but everyone understood. The stocks, the lash, disappearance. And yet, something inside Marjorie refused to sink back into silence. She hadn't survived all this. Famine, fever, loneliness, just to return to what was before. Her husband, Giles, once soft-spoken and worn from years of labor, had started drawing maps in the dirt by firelight. Not of faraway lands, but of nearby farms. Who had food? Who had seeds? Who might be willing to trade, or share, or, if desperate enough, join something larger than quiet suffering. It wasn't a rebellion. Not yet. It was more like a thread, slowly pulled through each household in the dark. A loaf of bread here. A whisper about a kind reeve there. Ideas passed under breath, never in daylight. Because they all remembered what happened to the Bakersfield boys. 3 sons from a neighboring hamlet who'd refused to return to their lord's fields after the plague. So they had their own tools, their own land now. The bailiff arrived with 5 riders. Only one boy returned, and he no longer spoke. The tension was everywhere, in the air, in the eyes of neighbors who once shared everything, but now kept their voices low. Even the animals seemed to move more quietly. The church bells rang less often. The local priest, Father Alric, who used to walk freely among the peasants, had become distant. Rumor was he'd been warned by the manor to mind his sermons. And then one morning, something happened that shook the village deeper than plague or hunger had. The steward was found dead. He'd been strict, cruel even, enforcing taxes with no mercy, taking grain even from the sick. His face was known, but never liked. And now he was gone. Not in a dramatic way. No fire, no blood in the square. He'd simply been found cold in the river. Slipped, they said. Drunk, maybe. But there were no bruises, no wounds. Just a strange emptiness where he should have been. Thomas heard the news while mending a gate. The blacksmith's daughter whispered it first, and it spread like smoke through the village. Everyone had the same question on their face. Was it an accident or something else? Marjorie didn't believe in accidents anymore. Not here. Not now. She kept her thoughts to herself, but her eyes were wide open. People had started watching each other. A missing sack of oats. A broken cart that wasn't broken the night before. Things were shifting, not just in the fields, but in the hearts of those who had always obeyed. And yet, the fear hadn't gone away. It had simply changed shape. Before, it was fear of dying, of starving, of being forgotten. Now, it was fear of being seen wanting more, seen thinking for oneself. At the manor, things were quiet. Too quiet. The Lord hadn't been seen in days. Only the guards came and went, checking the village, asking questions without asking them outright. Did you see anything strange? Has anyone new come through? Is everyone pulling their weight? One evening, Thomas noticed tracks near the edge of the woods. Not deer, not fox, boots, heavy ones, going places no one walked anymore. He didn't follow them, just stared. Something told him not to, and Marjorie had a visitor. A woman she hadn't seen before, cloaked and thin, with eyes too sharp for a peasant. She asked for water, for warmth. Marjorie, out of habit and heart, let her inside. They didn't speak much. The woman just sat near the fire, glancing at the door every few minutes. When she left, she pressed something into Marjorie's hand. A token, a small, carved piece of wood with a symbol that didn't match any church or guild. Marjorie didn't ask questions. She hid it under a loose floorboard and didn't mention it to Giles. The days passed, but the mood never lifted. The steward was buried quietly. No bell, no prayer, just a patch of earth by the chapel wall. The manor sent a new one, colder than the last. He didn't speak to the villagers, only watched. Then one night, dogs began barking. Loud, panicked. People came to their doors, lanterns in hand, staring into the darkness. There was no fire, no horsemen, just the sound of footsteps on the path, many of them, followed by silence. In the morning, 3 homes stood empty. No sign of struggle, no blood, no note, just absence. Everyone pretended not to notice, but no one met each other's eyes. Mothers held their children closer. Men kept tools by their doors. The fear had returned, but now it had a face. Mystery. The unknown. Were the missing punished? Or did they leave on purpose, pulled into something bigger? Father Alric finally spoke that Sunday, voice shaking more than usual. There's a time to bow and a time to rise, he said, barely above a whisper. But know that to rise too soon is to be crushed by what you cannot yet see. No one knew what he meant. Or maybe they did. Either way, no one asked. Marjorie found herself waking earlier and sleeping less. She watched the road. She counted the villagers. She listened to the silence between the sounds. Giles had stopped drawing in the dirt, but his eyes told her he hadn't stopped planning. And still, behind every sigh, every shovel of earth, every bowl of thin stew, the question hung heavy in the air. What happens next? Because something was coming. Not famine, not plague, but something else. A reckoning, a choice. And for the first time, the peasants were no longer waiting to be saved. They were deciding if they could save themselves. The wind had shifted. It came colder now, sharper, cutting through the village like it carried more than just weather. In the mornings, frost curled around the edges of the thatched roofs, even though it was too early in the season. Old folks whispered that signs like this used to mean war or change, or worse, a bad winter. The kind that buried everything, including the living. Marjorie noticed the change in people first, how they moved differently, spoke less, avoided standing in the open too long. The market stalls, which used to be small gatherings of noise and laughter, had turned quiet. Trade were quick. Barter was strict. Even gossip had dried up, replaced by long glances and nods that said more than words ever could. No one had seen the woman in the cloak again, though a few claimed they spotted someone near the river late one evening. A figure kneeling beside the water, motionless. When they called out, it vanished into the trees. Rumors began to grow, stories of a group living in the woods, people who had walked away from the manors altogether. They called them the Unbound. No proof of them existed, only whispers and warnings. Some said they hunted at night. Others said they helped those who had disappeared. Thomas tried to keep his head down. He still worked the land, still sharpened his tools, still nodded when the reeve passed. But he was watching, always watching. He had noticed something strange. The manor had begun sending strangers through the village. Not soldiers exactly, but men who didn't look like they belonged. They asked too many questions. Who's moved recently? Have you seen any unusual gatherings? Who's speaking to outsiders? They never stayed long, just watched, noted things in small books, and moved on. But their presence was a warning. The lords were nervous. And nervous lords made dangerous decisions. The manor itself had changed too. Fires burned longer into the night. One of the guards, a younger one, told Thomas that a scribe from the city had arrived, bringing new orders. They're counting bodies now, the guard muttered. Not for burial, for control. He looked around as he said it, then hurried off, as if he already regretted speaking. Meanwhile, Marjorie kept to her routine, but with more care. Every trip to the well, every visit to the chapel, was done with her ears open. She'd begun keeping a small journal, not on paper, which was too rare, but scratched into pieces of broken slate behind her hearth. Names, events, who had gone missing and when. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start seeing patterns. 3 days after the last disappearance, someone left a note under her door. No name, just a simple line. Not all chains are iron. It was written in charcoal, smudged by a thumb. She didn't show it to Giles, but she didn't throw it away either. She folded it carefully and placed it beneath the carved token, hidden under the floorboard. Then, something unexpected happened. Father Alric vanished. No warning, no sermon, no sign of a struggle. His small room behind the chapel was left untouched, his cup still full, his blanket still warm. The bishop's men were sent for, but no one had answers. They blamed wolves, of course. They always did, but everyone knew better. Alric had said too much. He'd hinted at something coming. Now he was gone, and the village was left without a voice. Some said he fled. Others said he was taken. Whatever the truth, the silence he left behind was loud. Giles, who had always been cautious, began walking farther from the village during the evenings. He never said where he was going. When Marjorie asked, he just smiled softly and kissed her forehead. She didn't press him. She knew the look in his eyes. He was carrying something bigger than words. One night, he returned with blood on his sleeves. Not much, just a few streaks. She didn't ask. He didn't speak. But that night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling until dawn. Meanwhile, the children of the village, always more sensitive to shifts in mood, had begun to play differently. Their games now mimicked soldiers and secrets. One boy even carved a mock gallows out of sticks, hanging a doll made of straw. When a mother scolded him, he said, "It's what they'll do to us." No one laughed. And then came the order. A new decree, nailed not just to the chapel, but to every barn, doorpost, and fence. It was written in both Latin and the common tongue, as if to ensure everyone could understand its weight. All those who leave their assigned holdings without written leave shall be considered fugitives. Assistance to such persons will be seen as treason against the crown. Treason. That word changed everything. Treason meant death. And now, survival was no longer just about food. It was about choice. About where you stood. With the manor or against it. There was no middle ground left. Some villagers began aligning themselves clearly. A few men started walking with a reeve, pointing out who spoke with whom, who stayed out late, who muttered when orders were given. These people gained small favors, extra flour, shorter labor days, but they were no longer trusted by their neighbors. They were marked quietly as betrayers. Others disappeared without word. A family here, a young man there. Gone. No trace. No goodbyes. Just an empty cottage, a cold hearth, and a growing sense of dread. Thomas received a warning one morning. A pebble on his doorstep, marked with an X in ash. It wasn't a symbol from the manor. It meant something older, a mark used by field workers during hard winters to signal danger. He wiped it away before anyone saw, but he told no one, not even his sister. Marjorie's brother, Will, who had traveled between villages as a peddler, arrived with news. Not goods. He carried none, but stories. In other villages, things were worse. Whole hamlets burned, barns looted. Some peasants had risen, yes, attacked the Lord's men, taken stores, driven the rich from their halls. But they were hunted, tracked, names written down, rewards offered for betrayal. He said something that stayed with her. There's a list now. A real one. With names. Marjorie asked if he'd seen it. He shook his head. But I heard. And I believe it. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of what it meant. If there was a list, someone was keeping track. Someone was organizing this. Someone was planning something bigger than just quiet resistance. By the next week, tension cracked into violence. It started small. A storage barn was burned. No one hurt, but supplies lost. Then the Reeves son was found with a broken leg, thrown into the pig trough by someone who vanished before dawn. The manor responded with curfews and patrols. Guard no longer just watched. They searched. Homes were entered. Children were questioned. Marjorie's slate journal was moved to a safer place, buried beneath the roots of the old ash tree behind her house. Giles became more withdrawn. He spoke in riddles now, half thoughts and questions. What if it doesn't work? He asked one night. What if we're just animals in a cage, fooling ourselves that the gate is open? She didn't answer, because the truth was no one knew anymore. Everyday survival had become a mask. People still worked the fields, still baked bread, still knelt at the chapel. But underneath, something simmered. Resentment, anger, hope twisted into something more dangerous. A longing for change, no matter the cost. One morning, Marjorie received a second token. This one was carved differently. A half moon with 3 marks beneath it. She didn't know what it meant. But later that day, a stranger passed through the village pretending to be a tinker. When he stopped to fix a pot or door, he said quietly, "The moon rises next fortnight. Be ready." Then he was gone. No one else saw him. No one else mentioned it. But Marjorie began preparing. She dried what little meat they had. She wrapped tools in cloth and placed them under the hearthstones. She whispered to a few trusted neighbors, one she knew would not speak, and passed along simple messages. Nothing direct, just signs. Check the ash tree. Watch the stars. Remember the Bakersfield boys. The Reeve was growing suspicious. He increased the patrols. Guards now entered the chapel during prayers. The blacksmith's apprentice was taken for questioning and didn't return. A week later, his father was found hanged behind the forge, the word traitor scratched into the wood above him. But the villagers didn't break. They buried the man quietly. No one spoke during the burial. But the silence meant something different now. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. Even the children felt it. One girl, barely 9, began drawing maps in the dirt near the well. Not of roads or farms, but of escape routes, paths through the woods, caves hidden in the hills, rivers shallow enough to cross. When asked where she learned it, she said, "My brother. He left last spring. He said he'd come back when it was time." Everyone wondered what it was. Now, the night grew heavier with each passing day. Not just darker, but thicker, like it held secrets in its folds. And in that darkness, something stirred. Not rebellion exactly. Not yet. But something older. A decision rising in the hearts of the quiet ones. Because they had survived famine. They had endured plague. And now, as they stood beneath the weight of lords and fear and silence, they asked themselves the question no peasant was ever supposed to ask. What if we are not powerless? What if we are many? And if we are many, what comes next? The answer was close. They could feel it. And when it came, when a moon rose, when the names were called, when the gate was found unlocked, would they be ready? Or had the chains grown too tight to break? The days leading up to the full moon felt wrong in a way that couldn't be explained. The village didn't look different, not at first glance. Chickens still clucked in the dust. Bread still baked in the ovens. The smithy's fires still glowed. But underneath it all, something trembled. A tightness had taken hold. Not of the body, but of the spirit. Every sound felt louder. Every silence felt longer. Every passing glance felt like a question. Do you know? The manor guards had doubled. They no longer wore the quiet, casual sneer of confidence. Now, they moved with their hands resting near their hilts, heads turning at every creak of a door. They no longer patrolled. They hunted. It was clear they knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Marjorie watched it all from the edge of things. She became a shadow in her own village. She moved carefully, speaking less, watching more. When she fetched water, she studied who lingered at the well. When she passed the grain house, she marked who had added nothing to the communal stores. She had learned to read people like weather now, picking up the small signs, the changes in pressure. Giles no longer smiled. His hands were blistered from more than farm work. His boots, once clean, were now lined with ash. Some nights, he didn't come home until nearly dawn. When he did, he stood at the door a long while, as if listening for something only he could hear, before he stepped inside without a word. Marjorie never asked. He never explained. But one night, when he removed his cloak, she caught a glimpse of something under his shirt. Not a bruise or a cut, but ink. A mark, sharp and deliberate. She didn't know its meaning, but she knew it wasn't just for show. Whatever Giles had become part of, it was bigger than a rebellion. It was a vow. Word spread, quietly, of new laws passed in the distant city. Something about land registration and tax reform. The words sounded harmless, even helpful, but Marjorie knew better. It meant control. It meant the crown, or those serving it, were preparing for a change. The kind that required full obedience. And full obedience always came with a cost. Then, one cold morning, the reeve called a gathering. He stood beneath the chapel bell with two unfamiliar men beside him. One wore the deep red of the capital. The other wore the black leathers of the Lord's personal guard. They didn't speak at first. They let the silence settle like dust. Then the man in red stepped forward. He spoke calmly, as if his words weren't heavy with threat. We are here to protect order. Those who aid fugitives, withhold information, or gather unlawfully will be punished under decree. As of tonight, all villagers will remain within their homes from dusk until dawn. Any violation will be taken as treason. No one responded, but the message was clear. The noose was tightening. That night, torches were lit along the manor walls. Not just for light, they were signals, beacons, warning flares. Marjorie could see them from her window. Each flame felt like a finger pointing down, accusing. And for the first time in weeks, she felt afraid. Not for herself, but for everyone. The next day, a boy disappeared. Jacob, only 12, last seen near the chapel. His mother searched all morning, crying out his name, but no one answered. No one had seen anything. No one spoke up. But that night, beneath the ash tree, Marjorie found something new, a piece of cloth. Not Jacob's, but a guard's. Torn, blood-stained. She buried it again quickly. The message was obvious. The villagers were no longer running. They were fighting back. That evening, Giles gave her a look she couldn't explain. There was something behind his eyes. Not fear, not even hope. Something more dangerous, determination. He kissed her softly on the forehead and whispered, "Don't be afraid of the dark tonight." Then he left. She didn't sleep. She sat near the hearth, the fire low, her hand on the iron poker. Just in case. Outside, the wind picked up. The full moon had risen. It was then, in the stillness, that she heard it. A bell, but not the chapel bell. A different sound. Lower. Distant. Then another. Then a horn. Then silence. Then 3 short knocks on the door. Not loud. Not rushed. Just enough to make her freeze. She opened the door slowly and found a girl standing there. Maybe 16, eyes wild, hair tangled with bramble. "He said you'd help," the girl whispered. Marjorie didn't hesitate. She pulled her inside and closed the door. The girl carried something wrapped in cloth. When Marjorie peeled it back, she found maps, real ones, with routes, symbols, crosses, paths through the forest, hidden clearings, supply caches. The girl pointed to one mark in particular. "They're gathering here, tonight." Before the signal, Marjorie didn't ask who they were. She already knew. The unbound. The ones who had left the manors behind. And now, it seemed, they were returning, not in chains but in silence. Outside, a scream echoed. Then another. Then the pounding of hooves. Guards moving fast. Marjorie grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her to the back door, guiding her through the garden into the dark. They crouched low as figures passed, guards dragging someone, maybe 2 people. The guards barked orders, accusing them of hiding stolen grain. No one was fooled. The accusations didn't matter. The goal was fear. When the torches passed, Marjorie turned to the girl. "What's the signal?" The girl hesitated, then said softly, when the wind dies. It didn't make sense, but somehow it felt right. All that day and the next, tension built like pressure in a sealed room. People moved quickly, but said little. The Reeves' eyes darted nervously. The manor guard stood with tighter ranks. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. And then, as the sun dipped below the horizon on the third day, it happened. The wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped. No rustle in the trees. No whisper across the grass. Just silence. The signal. That night, Marjorie saw it with her own eyes. Dozens, no, hundreds, emerging from the tree line. Not wild, not disorganized, but precise. People of all ages, dressed in cloaks, carrying tools, not weapons. Buckets, ropes, shovels, torches unlit. They moved like water, flowing into the empty corners of the village. Silent, focused. One of them stopped at Marjorie's fence and nodded to her. A boy she hadn't seen in years, presumed dead in the famine. Now tall, strong, marked with the same ink Giles had borne. They hadn't come to burn. They couldn't take back. At the manor gates, the guards scrambled. Orders were shouted. Bells rang. But no attack came. The unbound didn't storm the gates. They surrounded. Quiet. Patient. They began pulling carts into position, stacking barrels, creating walls. Not to trap others in, but to keep the Lord from escaping out. Inside the manor, panic took root. The Lord Steward tried to send a rider for reinforcements, but the road was blocked. Not with barricades, with people. Old women, young boys, farmers. They stood in the path, unmoving, unarmed. The rider turned back. Inside the chapel, a candle burned. Marjorie waited with others, unsure what would come next. Whispers filled the air. Someone said Giles had been seen near the manor's east gate. Another said a scribe had fled through the cellar. Another claimed the Lord himself had locked the doors and refused to speak to anyone. But still no violence. The waiting was worse, because waiting meant something bigger was coming. Then, deep in the night, the chapel bell rang. Once, then twice, then again. Not an alarm, a rhythm, like a heartbeat. The signal had changed. Marjorie stood. The others followed. They moved quietly, each carrying something. Food, rope, water, whatever they could offer. As they passed through the square, she saw what the signal meant. It had begun. The unbound had opened the manor gates. Not with force, with fear. Inside, the guards had laid down their weapons. Not all, but enough. They weren't just outnumbered. They were outwilled. The unbound didn't want a siege. They wanted the truth. And now, with the gates open, the reckoning would begin. Not just for the lords, but for everyone. For those who had stayed silent. For those who had betrayed their neighbors. For those who had hoped things would fix themselves. The village was no longer waiting. It was awake. And as the full moon climbed higher into the sky, casting its cold light on the faces of those who had endured famine, plague, and silence, a question hung in the air like smoke. Would justice be gentle, or would it burn? No one spoke the answer, but everyone knew. The climax had arrived, and what came next would change everything. The moon had barely moved from its place in the sky when the air shifted again. It wasn't the wind returning, it was something heavier, a feeling thick and cold that rolled through the village like a fog no one could see, but everyone could feel. The quiet that had settled earlier, charged and watchful, now felt like something else. Something uneasy. The unbound had opened the manor gates without bloodshed. They had the ground, the numbers, and the will of the people. But something about how easily the gates gave way felt wrong. Too easy. Too clean. Marjorie stood near the square, her hands clutching a basket filled with food she had gathered for those who had been hiding in the woods. The chapel bell had fallen silent, and so had the people. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. It was as though the entire village understood this wasn't over. Not even close. She turned when she heard soft footsteps approach from the chapel side door. It was the girl again, the one with the maps. Her name was Ella, she had learned. The girl's face was tight with fear, her lips pressed into a thin line. There's something wrong, Ella said quickly, voice low and urgent. They're not just guards. Not anymore. What do you mean? Marjorie asked, pulling her aside. They weren't afraid of the numbers. Some of them looked calm, as if they were waiting for us to come, like it was part of the plan. Marjorie's chest tightened. A trap? Ella nodded. I heard one say they've got orders to hold until dawn. That reinforcements aren't coming from the capital. They're already here. Marjorie stared at her. Here. Ella swallowed hard. In the woods. South of the ridge. A whole detachment. Hidden. Waiting. It didn't make sense. Why wouldn't they attack now, while the village was out in the open? Why hold back? Unless they were waiting for something else. A decoy. Marjorie turned toward the manor. The torches still flickered along the walls. Figures moved like shadows, the unbound, keeping watch, managing the gate, hauling supplies. But there were others, too, men she didn't recognize. They weren't part of the rebellion. Their posture was wrong, too stiff, too trained. And some of them were gone now, disappeared into the manor. She pushed past a few villagers and walked quickly toward the entrance. No one stopped her. Inside, she found Giles at the base of the stairwell. His eyes lit up when he saw her, but his face quickly turned serious. What is it? He asked. You need to pull everyone back, she said quietly. They're not all guards. Some are planted. I think they're waiting to spring something. He didn't question her. Giles turned and called to two of his men. Pull the west flank back. Now, quietly, keep eyes on the ridge, and send a runner to the watch post. Tell them to check for movement near the old well trail. As they moved, Marjorie took his arm. Ella said there's a full detachment south of here. They're waiting, but not to fight. Giles's jaw tightened. They're trying to draw us in. Trap us inside. A scream echoed from above. It was sharp, sudden, not a cry of pain, a cry of warning. Then the first explosion ripped through the floor. The manor shook. Dust and stone flew into the air. A section of the east wing collapsed inward as fire burst from beneath the ground like a waking monster. The trap had sprung. Beneath the manor, the tunnels, the wine cellars, the foundations had been rigged. Marjorie stumbled back as debris rained from above. More screams now. Panic. The air filled with smoke. Giles grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the doorway, shouting to his people, "Get them out. Get everyone out now." But it was chaos. No one knew where to run. A second blast tore through the courtyard, sending bodies flying. The unbound scattered, pulling wounded out of the flames. One of the carts exploded, lighting the hay on fire and casting a hellish glow across the square. From the ridge, horns blared. Not village horns. Military. Then came the sound of hooves. Heavy. Dozens. And shadows moving through the trees. The reinforcements weren't waiting anymore. They were charging. Marjorie's heart pounded as she helped drag a boy from the rubble. He was no older than 15, his leg twisted unnaturally. Blood ran down his cheek, but he was alive. Barely. She looked up and saw them. Riders cresting the ridge, dressed in black and gold. No banners, no mercy. They weren't from the capital. This was something darker. Private. Elite. The kind of men sent to clean up a story, not protect the people. The rebellion had underestimated their enemy. Giles barked orders, trying to regroup, but it was too late to hold ground. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was survival. Back. Fall to the river, he shouted. We'll lose them in the marsh. But the riders were fast. They didn't go for the strong. They cut through the sides, targeting messengers, injured, and those running slow. It wasn't an ambush. It was a purge. Marjorie ran, pulling the wounded boy with her. Ella appeared beside her and grabbed the boy's other arm. Together they dragged him toward the fence line. All around them, the village burned. Not entirely, not like a raid, but enough to leave a message. This wasn't punishment. It was a reset, an erasure. When they reached the tree line, Marjorie dropped to her knees, gasping. The boy was unconscious. Ella checked his pulse. Still breathing, she whispered, but barely. Marjorie looked back. The square was overrun. The chapel still stood, but its bell tower had fallen. The manor was broken. The unbound had scattered, those who could. Others were captured, or worse. And the worst part? No one would know. No songs would be sung. No messages sent to the next village. The soldiers had already begun sealing the roads. Then through the trees a sound, not hooves this time. Marching. Heavy. Synchronized. Marjorie froze. Another group. Coming from the west. But this one wasn't wearing black and gold. This group held torches. Real ones. Dozens of them. And at the front walked a figure in robes. Not a warrior, but a scholar. An archivist. She knew that face. High Cleric Renard. He had been missing for months. Some said he had died in the Great City Fire. Others said he had fled after exposing corruption in the council. But here he was, walking with a caravan of survivors, refugees, and perhaps something more. Truth. Giles appeared beside her, bleeding from his shoulder, but still standing. That's Renard, he said, breathless. He was supposed to be in exile. Looks like exile's over, Marjorie said. Behind Renard, carts carried scrolls, crates, boxes. One of the guards accompanying him nodded to Giles. Then he spoke, not loudly, but enough for those gathered to hear. The truth survived, and it's time they remembered. It didn't make sense yet, but it would. Marjorie looked back once more at the burning village and the manor still smoking in the night. It wasn't a defeat. It was a revelation. Someone, somewhere, had known this moment was coming, and they had prepared. The second plot hadn't been rebellion. It had been restoration. While the unbound fought to take back the land, someone else had worked to recover the history. The lost names, the true deeds, the bloodlines that had been erased by those in power. It had been hidden, protected by scholars and monks thought dead. Now it returned, not as weapons, but as proof. Proof of illegitimacy. Proof of stolen titles. Proof that those who claimed power had taken it without right. Marjorie looked at Ella. They didn't just want to stop the rebellion, she said slowly. They wanted to stop the truth. Ella nodded. But now it's too late. Giles looked down the path as Renard's caravan entered the clearing. Behind him, others followed. Survivors from other villages. Soldiers who had deserted the crown. Healers. Children. All coming together, not to fight, but to reveal. And with them came the greatest threat of all. The written word. Signed confessions. Birth records. Treaties never honored. Orders written in blood. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. As dawn approached, the fires burned lower, but the people stood taller. The second twist hadn't been a betrayal. It was a warning that the crown would rather burn the truth than let it be known. But the truth had survived. And now, as the ashes cooled, those still standing would decide what came next. They would either return to silence or speak. The sun rose slow and red, casting a strange glow over the scorched fields and battered trees. Smoke still drifted from parts of the village, but the fires had mostly died down. The worst had passed, or so they thought. Marjorie stood on the hill, overlooking what was left of the square. She'd barely slept. No one had. Not after what they saw last night. The air felt different now, not just because of the smoke, but because something had shifted. The lies were slipping away, and truth, raw, messy, and dangerous, was taking its place. Giles had been up all night, coordinating what was left of the unbound, tending to the wounded, and trying to understand the depth of what Renard had brought with him. Scrolls, ledgers, sealed records, personal letters, all meticulously cataloged. Names that had disappeared from history. Bloodlines hidden through bribes and threats. Laws that had never been repealed, just buried. It wasn't just a rebellion they were fighting anymore. It was a reckoning. Renard sat in what remained of the chapel, now a makeshift command center. He looked older than Marjorie remembered, thinner, with a quiet sadness behind his eyes. But there was also clarity, the kind that comes only after losing everything except purpose. They'll come again, he said softly, unrolling a brittle scroll. And this time, they won't make the mistake of underestimating us. Giles leaned over his shoulder. They'll call us traitors for having these. They already do, Renard replied. But now we can call them thieves. And we have the proof. Ella stood by the doorway, holding one of the scrolls she'd helped preserve. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. How do we share this? They'll shut down the couriers, block the passes, burn anything we try to send. We don't send it, Renard said. We show it. In the capital, the room went still. You're talking about open march, Giles said slowly. Through Crown territory. With civilians wounded, no real army. I'm talking about light, Renard said. You want them to listen? Show up at the gates and make it impossible to ignore. Show them the faces of the forgotten. Let the city hear their names. Let the truth knock on the king's own door. It was madness, and it was the only real option left. So they prepared. For 3 days, they gathered supplies. Word spread faster than they imagined. Through hidden signals, whispered messengers, old paths not found on maps. People came, not soldiers but citizens, healers, craftsmen, people who had lost something or someone to the silence. Some brought old documents, stories from grandparents, things they thought were just legend. Others brought hope, and that was more dangerous than anything. The march began at dawn. It wasn't loud or violent or even fast. It was steady, calculated, relentless. Hundreds walking together, holding scrolls and banners, speaking the names of the erased. Each step was a reminder that the truth was alive. Each voice was a crack in the wall of power. The roads weren't empty, either. They passed other villages, some afraid, some inspired. And more joined. A mother who'd lost her son to the crown's conscription. A former scribe who had fled after being forced to falsify records. A man who remembered a time before the taxes had tripled. They all had a piece of the truth. And together, they built a story too big to burn. But the capital had heard. On the 7th day, they were stopped. At the base of the valley, just before the ridge that overlooked the city walls, stood a line of soldiers. Not the secret kind. These were royal guards, in full colors, armor gleaming, weapons drawn. The line stretched wide. Behind it, cannons waited. Crossbows lined the hill. They were prepared. Ready. Giles stepped forward. "We're not here to fight." The captain didn't respond. "We're here to speak," Renard called out. "You can strike us down, but the truth won't stay buried." There was a long pause. Then the captain raised a hand. The soldiers stood still, unmoving. And from behind them rode a woman on horseback, her cloak trimmed in royal blue. She dismounted with purpose. When she pulled back her hood, the crowd gasped. It was Lady Avienne, the king's niece. She was supposed to be across the sea, married into power. But there she was, standing before them. She looked at Renard. "They told me you were dead. Many hoped I was," he replied. She glanced over the crowd. "You've come to expose him." Renard nodded. "And to restore what was stolen." Her gaze lingered on a scroll in his hand. Then she sighed. "Let them through." The captain hesitated. "That's an order," she said coldly. "Let them pass." And just like that, the soldiers stepped aside. No one cheered. No one moved at first. They were too stunned. But then Giles started walking, followed by Marjorie, then Ella, and then the rest. A slow, quiet procession through the gap, up the ridge, and into the valley beyond. The city came into view, tall, brilliant, and proud. But for the first time, it looked small compared to the truth marching toward it. They entered the gates under heavy watch, escorted straight to the high courtyard. Nobles whispered. Courtiers stared, but no one stopped them. Inside the grand hall, the king sat on his throne, flanked by advisors and guards. He looked older than the portraits. His eyes were sharp but tired. When he saw Renard, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, not fear, not anger, but something like regret. Renard bowed. "Your Majesty." The king said nothing. Giles stepped forward and unrolled one of the scrolls. "This is the record of the land your forefathers took without right." Ella held up a second scroll. "This is a confession from your uncle scribe, confirming the erasure of whole families from the registry." Marjorie laid a small, leather-bound book on the ground. "And this belonged to the first heir, whose death was staged so your line could rule." The court was silent. Then Lady Avienne stepped forward. "They have more, and I've seen enough. The people deserve to hear it." The king stared at the scrolls. He didn't move, didn't speak. For a moment, it felt like something would finally shift. But then the doors slammed open behind them. A man entered, cloaked, armored, and flanked by strange figures. His eyes were cold. He didn't bow. "I told you not to bring this into the court," he said, looking directly at Lady Avienne. "General Corwin," she said, her voice steady. "You no longer speak for the people." He didn't smile. "I don't speak. I act." And in a flash, it happened. His men drew weapons. The court exploded into chaos. The king stood, shouting for order, but no one listened. Guards clashed. Bernard was pulled back by Giles, just in time. Corwin lunged for the scrolls, but Ella was faster. She threw the bundle across the hall to Marjorie, who caught it and ran. Marjorie bolted through the side door, scrolls in hand, heart pounding. Behind her, shouts rang out. She didn't know where to go, just away. Through hallways, downstairs, past startled servants and locked doors. Then she turned a corner and stopped. Before her stood the old archivist, a man no one had seen in years. His face was lined, but his eyes sparkled. "You need a way out?" he asked. She nodded, breathless. He opened a hidden door behind a tapestry. "This tunnel leads to the observatory. From there, you'll find a man waiting. He's expecting you." "Why?" she asked. "Because the truth was never meant to reach the throne," he said quietly. "It was meant to reach the people." She ran. Through the tunnel, up the winding staircase, and into the open observatory. The stars still faint in the early sky. And there he was, a man in simple robes, holding a horn. "I'm to announce?" he asked. She nodded and handed him the scrolls. "Read them all." He looked at the seals and nodded slowly. Then he stepped to the edge of the tower and blew the horn. Loud, clear, piercing. The people below looked up, and he began to read. The words echoed across the rooftops. The names, the truths, the records. Not from the court, not from a king, from the people. Back in the hall, Corwin's forces faltered. The king rose and raised his hand. "Enough," he shouted. "Let it be heard." And just like that, it was over. But not as anyone expected. The final twist didn't come from battle or blood. It came days later when the king stepped down. He didn't flee. He didn't fight. He simply handed over the seal to Lady Avienne and said, "Let them decide who leads." He left quietly, with no guards, no crown, because he had seen the truth, and it was heavier than power. And the people, stunned, cautious, hopeful, did something they hadn't done in a long time. They listened. They voted. They chose leaders from the people, ones with no title, but a story worth hearing. And Marjorie? She returned to the village, where the fields were still burned, but the air was lighter. She planted new seeds, helped rebuild homes. And every night, she told the story to those who came to listen, the real story. With names, with pain, with truth. Because sometimes the loudest victory is a quiet one, and the sharpest sword is the one made of paper and ink. As the first thaw of spring softened the earth, the fields that had once cradled corpses and hunger now carried signs of quiet rebirth. Alric stood beside his son near the edge of the pasture, his boots half sunk in mud, his hands rough from sowing early barley. The worst of the hunger had passed. The wolves, both the ones with fangs and the ones with coins and titles, had been driven back, though never truly gone. Still, for the first time in what felt like generations, there was a kind of silence that didn't feel threatening. It just was. Ella had returned to the village a few weeks earlier. Her journey had taken her further south, where a small convent near the coast had taken her in after the fever broke her body. But not her mind. She came back changed, not hardened, but clarified, like iron that had spent time in the flame. She brought herbs and new techniques for treating wounds, things whispered from women who had treated the sick in hidden places, those who'd survived the plague before anyone knew what to call it. She shared this knowledge freely with the others, setting up a small bench under the chapel roof, where she would meet those too poor or too proud to ask for help. Alric had never said much to her about her return. He didn't need to. Every time she reached into the earth beside him, planting new life with calloused hands, it was enough. The Lord who had ruled over them, if it could be called that, was no longer a concern. After the villagers discovered his plans to sell off the food stores meant for the coming winter, they had no choice. The moment wasn't one of bloodshed, but of refusal. No one took up arms. They simply stopped. They stopped bringing in the grain, stopped serving at his hall, stopped giving their bodies in hours. And when the first frost came, the manor stood cold and hollow, abandoned from within and without. The young knight who'd replaced him under royal appointment had ridden in one bitter morning and left with a single trunk and no words. It was over, in the quiet way that real endings often are. But freedom didn't come with songs or feasts. It came with problems. The villagers had no structure, no system, no way to divide and store what they now owned collectively. Arguments broke out. Petty thefts became common. There were whispers that maybe they'd been better off with someone in charge. But that was always the question, wasn't it? Whether survival meant surrender, or whether people could learn to build something together without a boot on their necks. It was Tom Lin, of all people, who offered the simplest idea. He suggested a council, elected by the people, not by bloodline or title, but by trust. One elder, one worker, one healer, one tradesman, and one youth. Just 5 voices, rotating each season. No gold, no power, just the burden of keeping fairness. No one laughed at the idea. In fact, no one argued either. They were too tired for ambition. They just wanted to live. And Thomlin's idea, strange as it sounded, held something new, a way to move forward without falling back into the same holes. For a while it worked. Not perfectly. Some days the decisions weren't fair, and not everyone agreed with every rule. But it was theirs, and that, more than anything, gave the people reason to work a little harder and steal a little less. The seasons moved on. By the time 2 more winters had passed, the village looked almost nothing like the one that had once cowered under a flag bearing a lion's claw. The paths were no longer rutted from the weight of carts carrying away tithes. The chapel still stood, but now served more as a gathering hall than a place for fearsome sermons. Adela had transformed the space with dried herbs and shelves of crude remedies. Children sat at her feet to learn names of plants instead of saints, and she taught them that healing began with observation of both people and the land. Alric, older now, moved more slowly. His hair had grayed, and his shoulders slumped more than they once had. But his mind remained sharp. He was often seen sitting outside his hut with his son, speaking of seasons and changes and things you couldn't measure in bushels or coins. He had stopped fearing the things that once ruled his life: plague, hunger, the lash of a noble's whip. These days he feared different things: apathy, division, forgetting. One morning, as frost clung to the thatched rooftops, Alric gathered the village's youth beneath the old oak at the center of the commons. He did not speak from a scroll or a pulpit. He simply told stories, not the kind about dragons or saints or ancient wars, but stories of the village itself. How they once had no voice, how they had let themselves believe that suffering was natural. He talked about how change didn't arrive with banners or champions, but with small acts of courage and the refusal to look away. A girl named Lena, no more than 10, raised her hand. But if we have it better now, why do we still argue and get things wrong? Alric smiled, the lines in his face deepening like roots. Because being free doesn't mean you stop making mistakes. It means you take responsibility when you do. And it means you don't wait for someone with a crown or a sword to tell you what's right. That moment lingered. It wasn't profound in any way that would make it into a noble's ledger or a historian's record. But for the people there, it mattered. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were learning to live. The moral of their long struggle wasn't that they had overthrown a lord or cured sickness. It was that they had learned what they were capable of when they trusted each other more than they feared the world. The plagues had taken their strongest, the famines their proudest, and the lords their most faithful. But none of them had taken their will. And in a world that had taught them to bow, that alone was a quiet kind of revolution. By the time the youngest children had grown into the kind of people who didn't need to be told to listen, the village had become something different. Not just a place to survive, but a place to belong. The land, still harsh and reluctant to give, seemed less cruel when the harvests were shared rather than counted in secrets and stored under lock. Neighbors helped without weighing favors. Disputes happened, of course. Someone's goat wandered into another's cabbage patch, or a trade wasn't equal. But instead of escalating into feuds, they became chances to practice patience and fairness. Adela had long since stopped treating only cuts and fevers. She now mended wounds people didn't talk about, grief that lingered too long, anger that refused to leave, fear passed down like an heirloom. She'd listen more than she'd speak, letting silence do its work. People called her wise, though she never claimed to be. All she'd say was, "I remember how we used to be afraid of dying, but never thought to ask if we were truly living." One foggy morning, a messenger arrived on horseback. He wore a badge from a new king, not the one who once claimed the region, but a distant ruler who had risen from a noble rebellion and now sought to unify fractured lands. He brought news of new taxes, new laws, and the promise of peace through obedience. He spoke with polished words, with scrolls sealed in wax, and looked around as if expecting deference. But what he found were men and women who didn't flinch. They listened politely. They offered him bread and water. They didn't kneel. He looked puzzled. "I've come with the king's decree. You must pledge loyalty." Our step forward, calm but firm. "We're loyal to each other. We've learned that no king understands our hunger better than we do. We'll hear what your laws say, but we won't forget how to govern ourselves." The messenger left before sunset, carrying a report that likely made its way into some royal archive. But nothing ever came of it. Maybe the king had too many other fires to put out. Or maybe he knew what others had learned too late. Control doesn't last where people have discovered the power of their own voices. Years passed. The children of those who had survived the darkest days began to ask questions their parents never had the luxury to ask. What lay beyond the forest? Could they grow barley instead of rye? Why did stories always start with war and end with kings? These weren't rebellious questions, but curious ones. The kind that only bloom where fear has loosened its grip. One boy, Tomas, spent a season living with a neighboring village. When he returned, he brought news of other communities that had also started to govern themselves, exchange seeds, and teach their own histories. The quiet revolution was spreading, not with fanfare, but with understanding. Ideas moved faster than soldiers. One night, around a fire, Ayala said something she hadn't voiced aloud before. "We didn't just survive the plagues and the lords. We outlived them." Auric, older still, nodded slowly. "But that only matters if we remember what they taught us." The villagers didn't build statues or sing songs of their hardships. They didn't crown heroes or write chronicles. But in every tool handed down, every boundary redrawn in kindness, every child taught to question and care, the story lived on. The moral wasn't in one moment of courage, but in the thousand small ones that followed. When you're taught your life is worth less because you have no title, no wealth, no bloodline, reclaiming your worth isn't loud. It's steady. It's saying no to cruelty, yes to community, and always asking, who benefits when we stay silent? As time wore on, it became clear that what truly kept the village safe wasn't luck or isolation. It was memory. Memory of injustice, yes, but also of resilience, and of how easily people can forget the price of forgetting. So they told their stories often, not to entertain, but to remind. They told of days when they had to bury their own, of nights when they ate broth made of bark and boiled roots, of mornings when lords came to take even the dirt from beneath their fingernails. And then they told of the day they said enough, the day they stood together, not to fight, but to live differently. They taught their children that history is not something distant, written in the language of kings. It's in every choice made by ordinary people when no one is watching. It's in standing your ground not with swords, but with truth. It's in building a world where no one is called peasant anymore. Not because the word is banned, but because its meaning has disappeared. The plague had taken breath. The famine had taken strength. The lords had taken dignity. But what remained was the will to care for one another, to grow hope from the very soil where despair once rooted deep. And in that, they found the truest kind of freedom. The seasons came and went with quiet rhythm. The elders would sit beneath the old oak tree near the edge of the village, watching the young ones run through the fields with laughter in their voices instead of hunger in their bellies. No one spoke about the past as a burden anymore. They spoke about it like a trail they had walked through together, muddy, cold, full of thorns, but one that had led them here. One afternoon, a traveler came from a far-off city, dusty and tired, asking for shelter. He was used to being turned away or charged coin he didn't have. But here, they gave him food, a place by the fire, and asked nothing in return except his name. He looked around at the village, small, quiet, but full of life, and asked, "How did you manage this? I've seen towns burn for less. I've seen people turn on each other just to survive." Alric, whose beard had long since turned white, leaned forward. "We did turn on each other. Once. And it almost broke us. We were hungry, afraid, angry. But we learned that no one wins when everyone loses their humanity. We chose to stop waiting for someone to save us, and started saving one another. The traveler stayed a while, helping in the fields, listening to stories, learning their ways. When he left, he promised to bring what he had learned to others. Not a perfect system, not a grand rebellion, just a different way of seeing, one that remembered the worth of every person. And so, the village's influence spread quietly, like a ripple on water. It didn't make headlines or songs. But slowly, villages became communities, and communities became networks. People began trading fairly, resolving disputes without weapons, caring for the sick without waiting for permission. What had started as survival had become culture, and that's where the deeper lesson lived, not just in enduring pain, but in refusing to pass it on. That generation, born in plague and raised in famine, had every excuse to grow bitter, to hoard, to dominate, as they had once been dominated. But instead, they chose to protect what little light remained in them. They chose to rebuild with care, not conquest. Over time, the word peasant disappeared, not because it was erased, but because it no longer fit. They weren't peasants. They were farmers, teachers, herbalists, singers, builders. They were people, and that was enough. Ella passed away one winter morning. She went quietly, with her hand in her daughter's and a blanket across her shoulders. Her grave was marked not with a stone, but with a tree, the same kind she had once used to brew healing tea for the sick. Each spring, its flowers would bloom pink and soft, as if to say, "You're not forgotten." Alric followed a few years later. His last words were a whisper, not of regret, but of hope. "Keep choosing each other," he said. "That's how we made it." Their stories remained, passed from mouth to mouth like heirlooms. Not polished tales of glory, but honest ones, about mistakes, forgiveness, and the kind of courage that doesn't shout. And the moral, if you look closely, wasn't just in what they survived. It was in how they refused to become like the world that had once failed them. They saw clearly what power could do, how easily it could strip a person of dignity, of choice, of worth. And so, they built a new kind of power, one rooted in compassion, not control. Children grew up hearing these lessons, not in books, but in the way people treated each other, in the way no one went to bed hungry, in the way disputes were settled in public, with fairness and reason, in a way old wounds were acknowledged, not hidden. And maybe that's what truly made their story worth telling. Not that they were special, or chosen, or destined, but that they were ordinary and still chose to do better. That perhaps is the most powerful kind of history. The kind that says, you don't need a crown to change the world. You just need to care enough not to repeat it. The years passed like wind through the tall barley. Seasons no longer brought dread, but rhythm. The village once known for silence and struggle became known for song. Children grew up not with the constant ache of hunger, but with questions, curious, bold, alive. They asked their elders about the past, and the elders, now gray and slow but still alert, would sit near the fire or under a tree and share the truth. Not the myths of glory, not tales of easy triumph, but the truth of what it meant to simply endure. Were the lords cruel? One boy asked Auric's grandson one evening. They were men, the old man replied, and men can't forget how to see others as people when they only look down. But some remembered, and some of us made them remember. And that was the core of what had changed. The people, those so often called peasants, had reshaped not just their land but their place in the story. They no longer saw themselves as helpless victims of fate or pawns in the games of kings. They saw themselves as part of the world, essential to it, shaping it with every day they rose to work, to teach, to care, and to protect. Even the forests remembered. The old groves that had once hidden the sick and starving now stood like quiet witnesses to a time when nature had been the only ally. Now, those same woods were respected, their herbs gathered not out of desperation, but with care and gratitude. The balance had returned, not because someone decreed it, but because people remembered what it felt like to live without it. Occasionally, a traveler would pass through, bringing stories of war in the cities or the rise and fall of another noble house. The villagers would listen quietly, nodding, asking few questions. These things still happened, they knew. The hunger for control and gold had not left the world entirely. But here, in this small piece of earth where something ancient had been reclaimed, those things held little power. And so, the generations grew. Each one carried fewer scars, but none forgot the lessons. There was the lesson of plague, that even the most fragile lives are worth fighting for, and that community can heal in ways medicine sometimes cannot. There was the lesson of famine, that no one is free while another starves, and that food is not just survival, but dignity. There was the lesson of the lords, that power should be held with humility, and that when people rise together, they are not so easily ruled. And there was the lesson of resilience, that ordinary people, given time and trust, can do extraordinary things. In the spring of what came to be called the Year of Turning, a great gathering was held. Not a coronation, not a festival of kings, but a simple circle of villages where people shared what they had learned. They brought their methods of farming, of healing, of settling disputes, of teaching children without fear. An old woman from a coastal hamlet stood before them and said, "We used to think our lives were small, that history belonged to castles and crowns. But we see now, we were the story all along." The people nodded, because they had lived it. They had turned graves into gardens. They had replaced silence with songs. They had turned survival into legacy. Auella's granddaughter, now a midwife and keeper of stories, stood next. She held a bundle of cloth in her arms, a newborn. This child will grow up never knowing what it's like to fear the tolling of the plague bell. That's her doing, and it matters. The crowd grew quiet, not in sorrow, but in reverence. They had built something lasting, not through conquest, not through force, but through shared purpose and stubborn hope. Later that night, as the fire crackled and the children slept, the elders sat together one last time. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their eyes met, and they understood. They had seen the world nearly break, and had helped it bend another way instead. One man, once a servant who had stolen crusts of bread just to stay alive, whispered, "Do you think they'll forget?" "No," the others replied. "Not if we keep telling it right." And so they did. And now, centuries later, when someone visits that land, they may not see palaces or monuments, but they will find something rarer. They'll find communities where the sick are cared for without shame, where food is grown with shared hands, where disputes are solved in circles, not swords, where the past isn't erased, but carried gently, like a flame, passed from one heart to another. That is the moral. That is the lesson from those long-ago medieval peasants who outlasted plagues, outwitted famine, and rose gently above the reach of cruel lords. That survival is not just about staying alive. It's about how you live once you survive. The true legacy of that time isn't found in who ruled or what was written in royal books. It's found in the unrecorded, quiet acts of courage. In the mother who shared her last spoon of broth. In the child who fetched water for a stranger. In the farmer who refused to raise prices when others starved. In the healer who stayed in the sick house until the last fever faded. Those moments are the real history. And in them, we find the kind of wisdom that still matters. That still lives. That still speaks. Even now. Even to us. In the quiet moments after the fire died low, when only the whisper of the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl filled the night, the villagers would often find themselves thinking back to those darkest days. Not because they wanted to relive pain, but because those memories held the roots of who they had become. They remembered the long winters when the snow blanketed fields so deeply that even the strongest oxen struggled to pull their carts. when hunger was not just a whisper in the belly, but a gnawing emptiness that crept into bones and minds alike. Those were days when hope felt like a fragile thread, and every day survived was a small victory. Yet somehow life endured. You see, it wasn't just about the food or the warmth. It was about the simple acts that made survival possible. The neighbors sharing what little they had. The women who gathered herbs despite the biting cold. The men who repaired fences and tools, not because they would be rewarded, but because they understood the delicate balance that kept the village whole. The lords, those distant figures in towering castles, were often unaware of these quiet struggles. They saw only taxes, crops, and soldiers. But the peasants knew a different truth. They knew how fragile life really was beneath the heavy stone walls and fancy clothes. One such story told in hushed tones around fires was that of Eleanor, a young woman who had lost her entire family to the plague. Rather than giving in to despair, Eleanor had taken it upon herself to care for the village children who were orphaned. She gathered what little food she could find, tended wounds, and taught the youngest how to read from scraps of old parchment she had found in a ruined manor house. Her hands were often raw and bleeding, but her heart never wavered. Eleanor's courage reminded everyone that even in the face of relentless death, the human spirit could shine. She became a symbol, not of wealth or power, but of compassion, determination, and hope. These were the true treasures that no plague, famine, or cruel lord could steal. The villagers' reliance on one another created a kind of invisible shield against the harsh world outside. When the famine struck, fields that once lay barren were slowly coaxed back to life through shared knowledge. They learned how to plant hardier crops, how to catch rainwater in hidden cisterns, and how to store food in ways that protected it from spoilage. Even in the darkest times, laughter was never fully extinguished. It bubbled up in simple celebrations after harvest, in songs sung while working the fields, and in stories told to wide-eyed children. This laughter was not a sign of forgetting, but of resilience, a refusal to surrender to despair. But the lords, ever watchful, noticed the villagers' quiet strength. Some saw it as a threat, a challenge to their authority. There were whispers in the great halls about the unruly peasants who dared to teach themselves to read or gather without permission. Punishments were threatened, taxes increased, and soldiers sent to remind the people who ruled. Yet, even then, the peasants found ways to resist, not with swords or shields, but with unity and wit. They would meet under the cover of night, exchanging ideas, seeds, and supplies. When a tax collector came demanding more than they could pay, they would offer only what they had and hold fast to their dignity. One of the most remarkable stories from this time was that of Tomas, a humble blacksmith's apprentice. Tomas saw the toll that endless demands took on his village, and he began to speak quietly to others about the possibility of change. Not violent revolution, but steady, persistent demand for fairness. He gathered a small group of trusted friends, farmers, weavers, and even a few former soldiers disillusioned by the wars they had fought. Together, they wrote petitions, met with sympathetic lords, and slowly, painfully, chipped away at the barriers between classes. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. Some lords were angry, others were curious. Some villages became centers of quiet reform, where peasants were allowed to own small plots of land or make decisions in local councils. These small victories became sparks of hope, lighting the way for generations to come. Yet, the world was never simple. The plague would return in waves, famine would strike again, and the Lord's greed would persist. There were betrayals, failures, and heartbreak. But each time, the peasants learned. They adapted. They remembered the lessons of those before them. Through it all, the most precious thing they held onto was their sense of community, the knowledge that none of them were truly alone. That even when the world felt like it was crumbling, there was strength in togetherness. In quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the village settled into the calm of evening, the old ones would tell the children about the past, not as a tale of doom, but as a story of hope. They spoke of Eleanor, Tomas, and many others whose names were lost to history, but whose spirits lived on. They taught that true courage wasn't about wielding power or wealth. It was about standing with others in the face of hardship. It was about sharing what little you had. It was about believing, even when the night seemed endless, that dawn would come again. As you listen to these stories, perhaps you can feel the heartbeat of those long-ago lives, a rhythm steady and sure, like the turning of the seasons. You can imagine the smell of fresh earth after rain, the crackle of a fire as night falls, and the quiet determination in the eyes of a village that refused to be broken. This isn't just a story about medieval peasants surviving plagues, famine, and lords. It is a story about us, all of us, and the enduring strength that comes from community, hope, and resilience. And though the days of plague and famine are behind us, the lessons remain as vital as ever. How do we care for one another when times are hard? How do we stand up to injustice without losing our humanity? How do we build a future that honors the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before? These are questions that echo through history, whispered on the wind that once carried the fears and hopes of peasants across the fields. So as you drift into sleep, let these stories settle softly in your mind. Remember that even the quietest lives can hold great power. That sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and courage are the ones that change the course of history. And when you wake, carry with you the simple truth that we are all connected, bound together by the stories we share and the love we give. For in that connection, we find the true meaning of survival and the promise of a better tomorrow. The morning light would filter softly through the rough-hewn wooden shutters of humble cottages, waking the village with a gentle glow. Inside, families would stir from restless sleep, wrapped in threadbare blankets that barely held back the morning chill. The peasants knew that every new day was a chance to find food, to tend the animals, to mend broken tools, and, above all, to keep hope alive. Outside, the earth was often hard and unforgiving. Fields that fed entire villages had to be coaxed with sweat and patience. Many times, the soil had been stripped bare by years of famine, leaving only dust and cracked ground where lush crops should have grown. Yet, with the coming of spring, the peasants took up their wooden hoes and iron plows, planting seeds that carried not just life, but the future of their families. It was a quiet, humble rhythm, one that tied them to the cycles of nature and the whims of weather. Rain meant growth, drought meant hunger, and the lords who owned much of the land often saw these peasants not as people, but as cogs in a vast machine, their lives measured in the grain they produced and the taxes they paid. But the peasants' lives were far richer than any ledger could ever show. They were poets of the earth, storytellers of hardship and joy, guardians of traditions passed down through countless generations. Around smoky hearths, they sang songs about the seasons, about love lost and found, about battles fought long ago. There was old Marin, whose wrinkled hands still danced over the spinning wheel, weaving thread from the wool of their small flock. She had survived the worst years of plague, losing nearly all her kin, but never her spark. Marin's stories filled the children's eyes with wonder and fear, tales of mysterious illness, of strangers who appeared at night, and of the strange customs that came to protect the village when the world seemed to fall apart. Nearby, the village blacksmith, Joran, worked tirelessly in his smoky forge. His hammer fell again and again on glowing iron, shaping horseshoes, tools, and the occasional simple sword. His muscles ached, but the sound of his work was a steady heartbeat for the community. Joran's family had faced starvation more than once, but he believed deeply in the strength that came from honest labor and brotherhood. Life was not easy, yet every sunrise brought small miracles. A handful of wild berries found in the forest, a neighbor who shared the last loaf of bread, a child who learned to read from a tattered book found in a ruined chapel. It was these tiny moments of grace that kept the villagers moving forward, even as dark clouds of famine and disease loomed overhead. The plague was a shadow that never fully left. It would sweep through villages with terrifying speed, leaving grief and silence in its wake. The peasants did not understand why it came or how to stop it. Some believed it was a curse from God. Others thought it was punishment for sins. Whatever the cause, its arrival meant death and loss. And yet, somehow, life found a way to persist. In those terrifying times, the bonds between neighbors grew stronger. They cared for the sick, buried the dead, and whispered prayers into the night. Even the youngest helped, fetching water or gathering herbs that might soothe fever and pain. And when the plague passed, leaving behind emptiness and sorrow, the survivors would rebuild. Houses were repaired, fields replanted, and hearts slowly mended. Yet the greatest challenge was often the hunger that came after. The famine, a relentless companion to the peasants' lives, turned fields to dust and emptied granaries. There were days when children's cries could be heard across the village, their small bellies hollow and aching. In these moments, the villagers became more than neighbors. They became a family. Food was shared, even if it meant going without. Old stores were carefully rationed, and no one was left behind. In the face of starvation, the community's spirit was fierce and unyielding. The lords, distant and distant-minded, often raised taxes when times were hardest, demanding more grain and labor. This only deepened the peasants' suffering and resentment. Yet open rebellion was rare. The lord's soldiers were a constant reminder of the power imbalance. Instead, the peasants found quieter ways to resist. They would hide grain in secret caches, barter with traveling merchants, or delay deliveries just enough to survive a little longer. Amid all this hardship, faith remained a pillar of strength. The village priest, Father Anselm, walked among his flock with gentle words and prayers. His sermons offered hope of salvation beyond the trials of this life. The church was a sanctuary where grief could be voiced and shared, where the community could gather to remember the past and dream of a better future. And in the shadows of the towering castles and stone walls of the Lord's estates, the peasants whispered their own prayers. Prayers for mercy, for justice, for a day when their children might live free from hunger and fear. Yet the story of medieval peasants is not only one of suffering and survival. It is a story of resilience, of laughter through tears, of unexpected friendships, and of the small acts that kept humanity alive. Like the young boy named Ralph, who, despite his frailty, helped his mother gather firewood each day. His bright eyes held dreams beyond the fields, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would gaze at the horizon and wonder what lay beyond the forest's edge. Or Greta, the weaver's daughter, who taught herself to write by tracing letters in the dirt. Her curiosity was a small rebellion against a world that expected her to know only her place. She dreamed of telling stories, of traveling, of learning what made the stars shine. These personal stories remind us that behind the broad strokes of history, behind the tales of kings and lords, are real people. People with hopes, fears, and the will to endure. So as you listen, imagine the smell of fresh bread baking in a tiny oven, the crackle of twigs underfoot as someone journeys through the forest, the gentle murmur of voices sharing stories beneath a starlit sky. Imagine the strength it took to face each day when the future was so uncertain. The courage it took to hold on to hope when everything else seemed lost. This is the heart of their story, a story that belongs to every generation that has ever faced hardship and found a way through it. And though the world has changed since those medieval days, the lessons remain clear. That community matters, that resilience is born from connection, and that even the smallest light can shine in the darkest night. So let yourself drift with these stories. Let the voices of those long gone wrap around you like a warm blanket. And when you wake, carry with you their quiet strength and enduring hope. Because in remembering their lives, we find the courage to face our own. In the heart of the village, life moved at a steady, gentle pace, even amid uncertainty. Each day was marked by simple rhythms. The crow of the rooster, the soft clucking of hens, and the distant lowing of cows in the meadow. These familiar sounds were a comforting background to the peasants' daily toil, a steady reminder that life went on, no matter the hardships. Among the villagers, small celebrations brought welcome breaks from the relentless work. The annual harvest festival was one such moment, a time when the community gathered to give thanks for the crops they had managed to grow and stored away. Even when the harvest was poor, the festival was never canceled. The villagers would light a great bonfire in the village square, its warm glow chasing away the chill of autumn nights. Around it, people danced in simple circles, their laughter ringing clear and bright under the open sky. Old Marin would sit by the fire, her fingers busy weaving a small basket as she told stories of the past. Children would huddle close, their eyes wide with wonder as they listened to tales of brave peasants who outwitted cruel lords or outlasted the deadliest plagues. Her voice, soft and steady, was a thread connecting the present to centuries long gone. At the edge of the village, beside the winding river, Greta's family wove cloth that would be used for clothes and blankets. Watching Greta work, it was easy to forget the hardships around her. Her nimble fingers danced over the loom, creating patterns that told stories in thread of rivers, forests, and distant lands she only dreamed of visiting. The children were the heartbeats of the village's future. Their laughter echoed in the meadows as they played games made from sticks and stones, their imaginations filling the space between the rows of crops. Ralph, despite his frailty, loved to join in, his bright smile lighting up even the darkest days. Though life was often a struggle, these moments of joy were precious and deeply cherished. The peasants' connection to the land was more than just survival. It was a sacred bond. They believed the earth held spirits that watched over their crops and animals. Before planting, they would leave small offerings, a handful of grain, a carved wooden figure, or a whispered prayer, hoping to earn the favor of these unseen guardians. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, it would carry the faint sound of flutes and drums from nearby woods, as travelers or minstrels passed through. These rare visitors brought news from beyond the hills and songs from faraway places. For a brief moment, the village seemed larger, connected to the wider world. At night, under the endless canopy of stars, the villagers gathered to share their hopes and fears. The quiet murmur of voices was a balm to restless souls. They spoke of lost loved ones, of dreams for their children, and of a future where their burdens might be lighter. Even in the face of relentless plagues, famine, and the demands of distant lords, the village pulsed with life and resilience. Every face told a story of endurance. Every hand held the promise of another day. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself there, among the fields, the fires, and the stories that warm the hearts of those who lived so long ago. Let their strength and hope soothe your mind, carrying you gently into rest. The early morning mist hung low over the fields, softening the edges of the world as the sun slowly rose. In that quiet hour, before the village fully woke, Tomas walked out to the small stable behind his humble home. The rough wooden walls creaked softly as he opened the door to greet his old mare, Brindle. She nickered softly, nuzzling his hand as he offered her some fresh hay. For Tomas, Brindle was more than just an animal. She was a companion through long, tiring days. Together, they would help plow the earth, turning stubborn soil to prepare it for planting. Tomas often wondered how life might have been different if he could travel beyond the hills, where stories told of bustling towns and gleaming castles. But for now, his world was the narrow dirt path that led to the fields and the patch of sky above the village. In the cottages nearby, the smell of baking bread slowly filled the air. Old Helga carefully tended her hearth fire, stirring a thick stew of root vegetables and barley. The bubbling pot was meant to feed her family through the coming evening. Though her hands were worn and calloused, they moved with practiced ease, a rhythm born of decades of care and labor. Helga's granddaughter, Anya, was eager to learn. She watched silently as her grandmother demonstrated how to knead the dough, pressing and folding it until it became smooth and elastic. Anya dreamed of a life beyond the village, but she knew that for now, the strength of her family was rooted in the small, steady tasks that sustained them all. Nearby, the village children gathered by the river's edge, their voices low and excited as they hunted for smooth stones and shiny bits of glass washed ashore. Among them was little Jorin, a boy with wild hair and curious eyes. Though frail in health, Jorin's spirit was bright. He loved to imagine himself as a great knight, defending the village from unseen dangers. The elders often spoke in hushed tones about the plagues that had swept through the land years before, leaving behind silence and sorrow. Yet even in those dark memories, the villagers found ways to honor those lost, lighting candles in the chapel or carving wooden crosses to place by the graves outside the village. Life, they believed, was a delicate balance between the blessings of a good harvest and the threat of hunger, between the kindness of neighbors and the harshness of the Lord's demands, between hope and fear. As the day unfolded, the rhythm of work filled the air. The blacksmith's hammer rang out, shaping tools that would till fields and mend homes. The miller's will turned steadily, grinding grain into flour. Women sang quietly as they spun wool, their voices rising and falling like the gentle breeze. Through it all, the villagers relied on one another. When someone fell ill, neighbors would bring warm broth and help tend the sickbed. When the rains failed and the earth grew dry, they shared what little they had, knowing that survival was a shared journey. As twilight settled, the village gathered once more around the fire. Tales of bravery, loss, and resilience were exchanged, weaving the community together like a living tapestry. In these simple moments, the story of the medieval peasants came alive, a story not of grand battles or royal intrigue, but of everyday courage and quiet endurance. Among the villagers, one figure stood out quietly, old Ewan, the healer. His cottage was nestled at the edge of the forest, where herbs grew wild and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Ewan's knowledge came from years spent listening to the whispers of nature and the wisdom passed down from generations before him. He never claimed to be a miracle worker, but his remedies eased pain and mended wounds when a village doctor was far away. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, Ewan would walk through the forest, gathering roots, leaves, and flowers. His gnarled hands moved carefully, selecting only what was needed. To outsiders, his herbs might seem like simple plants, but to the villagers, they were precious gifts. Chamomile to soothe restless sleep, willow bark to ease fever, and lavender to calm troubled minds. One day, a knock came at Ewan's door. It was Marin's son, Jacob, a young man with a heavy heart. His wife, Lisa, had fallen ill, fever burning bright and refusing to break. Ewan listened quietly, his eyes filled with concern but also steady calm. Together, they set off to the small cottage where Lisa lay. The path was lined with wildflowers and brambles, shadows stretching long as the sun dipped low. The villagers often said the forest had moods, sometimes welcoming and warm, other times dark and foreboding. But to Ewan, it was a place of life and healing. At Lisa's bedside, Ewan prepared a bitter tea from elderberries and yarrow. He spoke softly, encouraging hope even when the nights were long and filled with worry. The community prayed silently, holding on to the fragile thread of hope that her strength would return. Meanwhile, in the fields, Tomas faced his own challenge. The spring rains had been sparse, and the soil was dry and cracked. His crops, his family's future, hung in delicate balance. Tomas rose before dawn each day, coaxing the earth, hoping the hard work and care might coax life from the stubborn ground. The village lord, far away in his stone keep, was unaware of these struggles. His demands for taxes and grain remained unchanged, adding weight to the peasants' shoulders. Tomas knew that failing to meet these demands could bring harsh consequences. Back in the village, Anya dreamed of learning to read and write, a rare wish for a peasant girl. She had found a discarded prayer book, its pages worn and faded, and spent quiet moments tracing the letters. The words whispered stories of saints, miracles, and distant lands. Anya's heart ached with longing for something beyond the fields and hearth. The night air grew cooler as the seasons shifted, bringing with them the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Fires burned low in the hearths, casting flickering shadows on rough stone walls. Families gathered close, sharing meals of pottage and coarse bread, their conversations weaving hopes, fears, and plans for the uncertain days ahead. Outside, the wind carried distant howls of wolves, a reminder of dangers lurking beyond the village's fragile safety. Children were tucked in early, their dreams guarded by the watchful eyes of parents and the silent stars above. Despite the hardships, life was rich in its quiet moments. The touch of a mother's hand, the laughter of friends, the steady pulse of the seasons. These were the threads that held the village together. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the gentle sway of the trees, the soft murmur of the river, and the steady heartbeat of a village that, though small and often overlooked, carried within it the timeless story of human endurance. As the cycles of the seasons moved steadily onward, the villagers clung tightly to their traditions, finding in them a rhythm that steadied their hearts. Though their lives were shaped by toil and hardship, moments of celebration broke through like soft rays of sunlight after a long storm. One such time was the spring festival, held at the edge of the village where the forest met the fields. It was a day when worries were set aside, if only for a while. The air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers woven into garlands. Children ran laughing between the adults, their faces bright with hope and freedom. The village bard, a man named Simon with a voice weathered by years but still strong, told stories passed down from his father and grandfather. His tales spoke of heroes and gods, of battles won and lost, and of the mysterious forces of nature that shaped their world. His words carried magic, even for those too tired to listen closely. Women brought baskets of freshly baked bread, sweetened with honey when it was available. Men shared small gifts, carved wooden figures, woven baskets, or jars of preserved fruit. These simple offerings were tokens of community, reminders that they were not alone in facing the uncertain days ahead. The feast was humble but hearty. Thick stews of root vegetables, fresh herbs, and whatever meat the hunters had managed to bring back. They ate slowly, savoring each bite as laughter and music mingled beneath the wide, open sky. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the villagers formed a circle around the great bonfire. Flames leapt high, casting dancing shadows on their faces, and the crackling fire seemed to carry away the worries of winter and famine. Songs rose and fell like the breath of the earth itself, joining the rustling leaves and the whisper of the wind. In these moments, Tomas felt something lift inside him, a fragile hope that life might endure despite the hardships. He watched Anya, her eyes shining bright as she listened to the tales, and felt a fierce protectiveness for the future they might build. But even amid celebration, tension lingered beneath the surface. The Lord's tax collectors were due to arrive soon, their demands harsher than ever. There were whispers that the next harvest might fail again, and fears that sickness still lingered in the shadows, waiting to strike. Old Ewan, watching the flames flicker, wondered how many more such nights they might have. His heart carried the weight of loss and the stubborn hope of healing. When the festival ended, the villagers returned to their homes, the fire's warmth fading but its spirit lingering in their bones. They carried with them the quiet knowledge that tomorrow would bring new struggles, and the strength to face them together. In the soft hush of night, as the village slipped into sleep, the stars blinked overhead, silent witnesses to the lives below, holding stories of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. The village rested quietly under a sky heavy with stars, their faint light shimmering through the chill night air. After the festival's flickering flames died down, and the laughter faded like a gentle echo, the villagers returned to their humble homes, simple shelters built with hands calloused from years of work, walls thick with stories and memories. Inside those walls, stories of survival and endurance whispered softly, carried on the breath of time. Old Ewan sat by his small hearth, the faint glow illuminating the wrinkles carved by decades of care and sorrow on his weathered face. He thought about the seasons that had passed, the friends and neighbors who had come and gone, and the delicate balance that held life together in this forgotten corner of the world. The herbs drying above the fire held promises, promises of healing, hope, and quiet resistance against the hardships the villagers faced. Ewan's hands rested on a bundle of lavender, its calming scent filling the room and easing the tight knot of worry in his chest. He remembered Jacob's wife, Lisa, and the long nights she fought fever, the fragile thread of her breath nearly breaking under the weight of the plague. Yet, somehow, she had pulled through, proof of resilience carved not just into the bones of the village, but into its very spirit. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient trees, carrying stories older than the stones beneath their feet. The forest, once feared as a dark and wild place, was now a quiet guardian. It held secrets of survival, plants that healed, animals that provided, and a world that moved in rhythms unseen but deeply felt by those who listened. In the fields, Tomas stood in the fading light of dawn, his gaze scanning the cracked earth where his crops struggled to grow. The soil was stubborn, but so was he. Each seed sown was an act of faith, each furrow a promise that life could and would continue despite the harshness of their world. The village lord's demands weighed heavily on his shoulders, but Tomas's spirit bent but did not break. He knew that these lands had fed his family for generations and would continue to do so, as long as hope endured. Nearby, Anya sat quietly by the flickering candlelight, tracing letters in the worn prayer book she had found. Her dreams of learning, of reading stories beyond the village borders, were small sparks of light in a world often shadowed by hardship. But those sparks were enough to ignite a yearning for something beyond mere survival. In these humble moments, beneath the veil of stars, around the flickering hearths, within the fertile soil, the true story of the village unfolded. It was a story not just of plagues and famine, of lords and taxes, but of people bound together by love, resilience, and quiet courage. The village may have been small, its struggles simple and often overlooked, but the human spirit within it was vast. It carried the weight of loss and the promise of tomorrow, balancing on a knife's edge between despair and hope. As the seasons turned, the villagers found strength in one another. The bonds forged through shared hardship were unbreakable. Mothers passed down stories of healing herbs and whispered prayers. Fathers taught their children the rhythms of the earth, the language of the wind, and the courage to face whatever might come. At times, the silence of the night brought whispers of fear, the unseen sicknesses, the threat of hunger, the harsh hand of the Lord. But it also brought comfort. Comfort in the steady rhythm of life, in the trust between neighbors, and in the gentle pulse of the earth beneath their feet. One crisp morning, as the village stirred awake, a quiet miracle took shape. The rains returned, soft and steady, soaking into the thirsty ground. Green shoots pushed through the cracked soil, fragile but determined. The fields began to promise harvest once more. Tomas, standing at the edge of his land, felt a swelling in his chest. Not just from the hope of food, but from the reminder that even the hardest winters give way to spring. His heart, like the earth, was ready to renew. Anya's eyes shone brighter than ever as she carefully copied letters from the prayer book, each word a step toward a future she dared to imagine. Her dreams were no longer distant shadows, but seeds ready to grow. Old Ewan, watching the village awaken around him, knew the struggle was far from over. But he also knew this. Life, in all its fragile beauty, would find a way. Through plagues, famine, and the heavy hand of lords, the villagers had survived. Not because the world was kind, but because their hearts were fierce. And in that fierce heart beat the true lesson of their story. Survival is not just about enduring the storms, but about finding moments of peace between the thunder. It is about the quiet kindness of a neighbor, the shared warmth of a hearth, and the hope that springs eternal in the human soul. The village, small and often forgotten, stood as a testament to this truth. Their story, woven with pain and joy, struggle and love, was a beacon across time. It whispered to us now, urging us to remember that even in the darkest chapters, light can be found. So, as you drift into your own quiet rest, imagine the soft rustle of leaves, the steady breath of the earth, and the gentle pulse of a village that refused to give up. Their story is our story, a story of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of the human spirit. May it carry you gently into sleep, and when you wake, may you carry a little of their courage with you.